Lucas Morris had never imagined he would one day be forced to defend something that had belonged to his family for generations. The riverfront land, tucked away from the chaos of the city, had been in his grandfather's name for decades, a quiet retreat surrounded by thick oak trees and the constant, rhythmic sound of flowing water. It wasn't just land to him, it was memories. Childhood summers spent fishing with his grandfather, evenings by the bonfire, the smell of pine and damp earth settling into his clothes. It was a piece of his past, something stable in a world that always seemed to shift. His grandfather had worked hard to maintain it, refusing every offer from developers who saw nothing but a future luxury estate waiting to be carved out of the wilderness. The property had remained untouched, pristine, a testament to his grandfather's resilience against those who saw land as nothing more than an asset to be exploited. But Lucas had been away for too long. His job had taken him overseas, and while he had always meant to return sooner, life had a way of pushing plans further and further down the road. Now, after nearly 3 years, he was finally back, ready to reclaim the home he had inherited, ready to make something of it, perhaps turn it into the permanent residence he had always dreamed of. Yet, as he pulled his truck onto the familiar gravel path leading to the house, something immediately felt wrong. At first, it was just small details, subtle changes that pricked at his instincts. The road leading to the property had been recently paved, the uneven dirt track replaced by smooth asphalt that looked out of place amidst the wild surroundings. A few hundred yards ahead, a cluster of uniform mailboxes stood where there had once been nothing but open space. Lucas slowed his truck, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel as unease crawled up his spine. He knew every inch of this place, and this wasn't how he had left it. Then he saw the signs. Metal plaques, freshly planted into the ground at regular intervals along the road, their bold lettering sending a wave of confusion through him. Private property, community access only. Trespassers will be reported. The words barely made sense. Community access? What community? This was his land, his grandfather's land. There had never been a community here. He pulled over, stepping out of the truck as the cool evening air settled over his skin. He approached one of the signs, running his fingers over the smooth surface, as if touching it would somehow make it less real. The metallic glint of the bolts securing it into the ground told him otherwise. Someone had installed these recently, deliberately, and without his knowledge. Lucas's heartbeat picked up as he climbed back into his truck and continued down the path, a gnawing sense of apprehension gripping his chest. The trees thinned out as he neared the house, and what he saw next made his stomach drop. His property, his grandfather's house, it wasn't empty. There were lights inside, the golden glow spilling out through the windows onto the porch. A small, silver sedan sat parked outside, alongside a golf cart emblazoned with the neighborhood security logo. Lucas slammed the truck into park, his pulse hammering in his ears as he stepped out. His front door, the same one his grandfather had built with his own hands, was painted a different color. The old wooden rocking chair that had once rested on the porch was gone, replaced with a small table and a pair of matching chairs that looked as though they belonged in some suburban backyard. Not here. This wasn't right. His hands curled into fists as he strode toward the house, skipping the stairs entirely as he stepped onto the porch. Before he could even knock, the door opened, and a woman mid-50s, blonde hair and a perfect bob, dressed in casual but expensive-looking clothes, stood in the doorway, looking at him with mild irritation rather than shock. She didn't look like a squatter. She looked like someone who belonged here, and that sent a spike of anger through his chest. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm, controlled, as if he were a salesman interrupting her evening. Lucas took a slow breath, forcing his voice to remain even despite the confusion boiling inside him. "Yeah, you can tell me what the hell you're doing in my house." Her expression barely flickered. If she was surprised, she hid it well. Instead, she let out a small, exasperated sigh, stepping onto the porch, as if she had every right to be there. "I don't know who you think you are," she said, folding her arms, "but this property is part of the community now. If you're looking to inquire about residency, you'll need to go through the proper channels." Lucas stared at her, barely processing the words. "Residency? Community? This is my property, It has never been part of any community. The woman gave him a tight-lipped smile, the kind people give when they think they're dealing with someone who just doesn't understand how things work. It's been vacant for quite some time, she said, her tone patronizing. The board determined it was in the best interest of the neighborhood to reclaim it for communal use. It was legally integrated into the district 2 years ago. His mind reeled. That's impossible. I never signed anything? No one in my family ever agreed to that? The woman's smile didn't waver. That's not how these things work. When property is deemed abandoned or improperly maintained, it can be reassigned through the proper municipal channels. If you'd like to dispute it, you'll need to file a petition with the district office. Lucas felt his fingers twitch, his nails pressing into his palms. This was beyond absurd. His grandfather had never been part of any homeowners association, and the land had always been his family's private property. How the hell had this happened? I don't need to file a petition, he said, his voice now dangerously low. I have the deed to this land. It's in my name. I don't care what your board thinks, it doesn't belong to you. For the first time, the woman's expression darkened slightly, as if his defiance was an inconvenience rather than a real problem. She glanced over his shoulder, and Lucas turned to see 2 men standing by the golf cart, watching them. They weren't in uniforms, but something about the way they carried themselves told him they weren't just random neighbors. I suggest you take this up with the district, Mr. Morris, she said smoothly. And in the meantime, I'd advise you not to trespass. Lucas clenched his jaw. The sheer audacity of it, the way she said trespass as if he were the one in the wrong, made his blood boil. But he forced himself to step back, to breathe. He couldn't fix this tonight. He needed to find out exactly what had happened, what legal loopholes had been exploited to take his land from him. But one thing was certain, this wasn't over. Lucas barely slept that night. He sat in his truck outside a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, his laptop glowing dimly in the darkness, as he scoured every document he had on the property. The deed was in his name. The title was clear. There was no mention of any communal zoning. No transfer of ownership, no agreements that could have possibly handed control over to the so-called board. But that woman, the way she had spoken to him, the confidence in her voice, the complete lack of hesitation, she believed she was in the right, which meant either she had been lied to or something far worse had taken place. He wasn't naive. He had heard stories before, people having their land taken through bureaucratic loopholes, neighbors conspiring to push someone out when they weren't around to fight back. His grandfather had always warned him about people like that, the ones who didn't see property as something personal, something earned, but rather as a resource to be controlled. That's what made him so determined to hold onto the land in the first place. And now, sitting here in the dim light of a parking lot, exhausted but wired with anger, he realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. They had planned this. The first thing he did the next morning was drive straight to the town's records office. The building itself was an ugly brick structure that looked like it hadn't been renovated in 30 years, the kind of place where paperwork got lost in overstuffed cabinets, and nobody ever had a clear answer for anything. Lucas didn't care. He walked through the glass doors, straight to the front desk, and demanded to see the latest property records for his land. The clerk, a tired-looking man in his 50s with glasses perched on the end of his nose, barely glanced up as he typed something into his computer. He frowned slightly, squinting at the screen, then turned to a small printer behind him. A single page slid out, and he handed it to Lucas without a word. Lucas grabbed it, scanning the document, his stomach tightening as he reached the bottom. Zoning change approved. Ownership transferred under District Realignment Initiative. The date was from 2 years ago. The exact time he had left for work overseas. His hands clenched around the paper. There was no sale record, no purchase agreement, just a bureaucratic note that his land had been absorbed into the community as if it had always belonged there. "This is wrong," he said, voice sharp. The clerk sighed, rubbing his temple, clearly used to people arguing with him about permits and zoning laws. "It's what the system shows," he said with a shrug. "If there was an issue, you should have contested it when the notices were sent out." "What notices?" Lucas demanded. The clerk raised an eyebrow and clicked a few more times on his screen. They would have been mailed to the listed owner at the time. My grandfather had already passed. Lucas snapped. No one was living there. I never got anything. The man exhaled slowly, as if this conversation had become more work than he was willing to put in. If the owner didn't respond to the notices within the allotted time, the property would have been considered abandoned and incorporated into the district. That's not how property works, Lucas shot back, his patience gone. You can't just take someone's land because they didn't get a letter in the mail. The clerk finally gave him his full attention, pushing his glasses up his nose. Legally, if a property is deemed vacant and unpaid municipal fees accrue. There were no unpaid fees, Lucas cut in. I set up automatic payments before I left. Everything was covered. The man hesitated, shifting slightly in his chair. Then that's something you'll have to take up with the committee that approved the transfer. Lucas stared at him for a long moment. The clerk wasn't being difficult on purpose. He was just another cog in the machine, another low-level employee following a paper trail that led nowhere. Yelling at him wouldn't fix this. But someone somewhere had signed off on this. And that meant someone was responsible. Who do I talk to? He asked, forcing his voice into something calmer. The clerk turned back to his screen, typing something else, before pulling another paper from the printer and handing it over. This is the office that handled the transition. You'll want to speak with the community director. Lucas looked at the name at the bottom of the page. Marion Hudson. Of course. He folded the paper and shoved it into his pocket, already heading for the door. If they thought they could steal his land with nothing but paperwork and red tape, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. By the time he reached the so-called community office, he was barely containing his temper. The building was newer, clearly funded by the homeowners who had decided they needed their own little government, complete with a reception desk and framed photos of smiling families on the walls. Lucas strode past a waiting area, straight to the front counter, where a young woman in a blue polo shirt looked up with a forced customer service smile. I need to speak with Marion Hudson, the woman's smile faltered. Do you have an appointment? No, she hesitated. She's very busy, then she can make time, Lucas said flatly. The woman looked uncertain, but before she could argue, a door opened down the hall and there she was, Marion Hudson. The woman who had stood on his porch the night before, talking to him as if he were the intruder, as if she had more of a right to his land than he did. She paused when she saw him, but recovered quickly, her expression shifting into something unreadable. Mr. Morris, she said, stepping toward him. I wasn't expecting you so soon. Yeah, well, Lucas said, voice tight. I don't like wasting time. Her lips curved slightly, but there was no warmth in it. Why don't we step into my office? Lucas followed her, his fists clenched at his sides. She gestured to a seat, but he ignored it, standing as she closed the door behind them. I saw the records, he said before she could speak. I saw what you did. She sighed, shaking her head as she moved to sit behind her desk. Mr. Morris, I understand this is upsetting, but the decision was made in accordance with community regulations. The land was considered abandoned, and proper procedures were followed. You mean the notices you sent to an empty house? Lucas snapped. The ones I never received. She tilted her head, as if considering his words. The burden of response falls on the property owner. If no one responds, we have to assume the land is no longer being maintained. Lucas felt his nails bite into his palms. Cut the bullshit. You knew exactly what you were doing. You waited until I was gone, then you buried the paperwork where I wouldn't see it. And now you're trying to tell me my land isn't mine anymore. She held his gaze for a long moment, then leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the desk. Mr. Morris, she said, her voice lower now. You can fight this. You can waste time and money trying to reverse what's already been done. Or you can accept that things have changed. The community has already made use of the space. It would be difficult to undo all of that. Lucas's jaw tightened. That sounds like a threat. She smiled, slow and deliberate. It's reality. Lucas forced himself to stay still, to breathe. They thought they had won. They thought he would walk away, but they had just made their first mistake. Lucas walked out of Marion Hudson's office with his jaw clenched so tightly it felt like his teeth would crack. Every part of that conversation had been carefully calculated, each word chosen not to provide answers but to exhaust him, to push him toward resignation. She hadn't even tried to justify what they had done because she didn't need to. People like her operated on the assumption that no one would fight back, that the legal system was too slow, too convoluted, too expensive for someone like him to challenge what had already been set in motion. They had taken his land while he was overseas, locked everything behind bureaucratic procedures and technicalities, and now they sat comfortably behind a wall of red tape, daring him to try and untangle it. But they didn't know him. They didn't know the kind of man his grandfather had raised, the kind of man who didn't fold just because someone in a polished office with a fake smile told him he had lost. He drove back to his property, gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles went white. The anger was burning hot, fueling every movement, but underneath it was something sharper, colder, a sense of purpose. They wanted to play games? Fine, he would play. But he wouldn't play fair. The first thing he did was park his truck right in the middle of the driveway, blocking any easy access to the house. He got out, walking the perimeter, taking stock of everything. The signs, the security cameras, those were expected. But there were other things, subtle ones, that made his skin prickle. A new garden bed that hadn't been there before, with freshly planted flowers, a small bench placed neatly in the shade of an old oak tree. They had made themselves comfortable. He stepped onto the porch, pushing open the door not even locked, and was greeted by the sight of furniture that wasn't his. The inside had been staged, like a model home, designed to look just lived in enough to be inviting. There were magazines on the coffee table, a coat draped over the chair, even a pair of sunglasses sitting on the windowsill, as if someone had absent-mindedly placed them there before stepping out for a walk. Lucas exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain in control. This wasn't just about paperwork anymore. They had taken his land, his house, and they had already begun erasing him from it. He moved through the rooms with measured steps, pulling open drawers, checking cabinets. The kitchen had been stocked with fresh groceries, the fridge humming quietly, filled with food that wasn't his. Upstairs, the bedroom looked untouched, but when he pressed his palm against the bed, the sheets were still slightly warm. Someone had slept here. That was the final straw. Lucas grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and began throwing out everything that wasn't his. Clothes, toiletries, neatly folded towels, all of it went onto the front lawn. He moved with precision, working through every room, methodically erasing their presence just as they had tried to erase his. When he was finished, the house felt emptier, but at least it was his again. He locked the door, this time his key still worked, and that was something, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. These people operated with entitlement, the kind that made them believe the world existed for their convenience. He needed something stronger. He drove to the nearest hardware store and bought industrial-grade chains and padlocks, the kind designed for securing construction sites. By nightfall, the driveway gate was chained shut, the porch doors reinforced, and the back entrance secured with a steel bar drilled into place. Let them try to waltz in now. Lucas barely slept that night. He sat on the porch with a baseball bat resting across his lap, eyes scanning the darkness, waiting for them to come back. And they did. Just before dawn, the sound of gravel crunching under tires pulled him from his light doze. A black SUV rolled up to the gate, its headlights cutting through the misty morning air. Lucas didn't move, watching as the vehicle idled for a moment before the driver's side door opened. Marion Hudson stepped out, dressed in yoga pants and a fitted jacket, looking more like she was on her way to a weekend brunch than a confrontation. Behind her, two men emerged different from the ones he had seen before, larger, built like they had done security work in the past. Marion approached the gate with a sigh, shaking her head as if he were some unruly teenager refusing to listen to reason. "Lucas," she called, her voice smooth, too calm. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." He stood, stretching out his back as he stepped down from the porch. "No, Marion," he said, voice steady. "You made it harder when you stole my damn house." She exhaled through her nose, crossing her arms. "No one stole anything. The property has been reassigned through completely legal channels. You're the one who showed up out of nowhere and started causing problems." Lucas let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "You really believe that, don't you? That if you say it enough times, it makes it true?" Her expression flickered just for a second. A crack in the mask. She wasn't used to being challenged like this. "You can't just barricade yourself in," she said, tilting her head slightly. "That's not how this works. Watch me." One of the men behind her shifted slightly, adjusting his stance. Lucas caught it instantly, the slight forward lean, the flex of his fingers. A test, seeing if he would back down. Lucas smiled, slow and deliberate. "Tell your lapdogs to relax, Marion," he said easily. "Unless you want this to turn into something real messy, real fast." She didn't respond right away, but he saw the tension in her shoulders. She knew. Pushing him further right now wouldn't go the way she wanted. Instead, she sighed, rubbing her temple as if he were the source of some great inconvenience. "You're making a mistake," she murmured. "This isn't going to end well for you." Lucas stepped closer, just enough for her to feel the shift in presence. "Neither is underestimating me." For the first time, she hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. But it was enough. She exhaled sharply, turning back toward the SUV. "We'll be back," she said over her shoulder. Lucas watched them go, the vehicle disappearing down the road, the tension in his chest coiling tighter, not loosening. Because this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Lucas knew he had forced their hand, but he wasn't foolish enough to think it was over. People like Marion Hudson didn't accept defiance as an answer. They thrived on control, on bending people into submission, on exhausting them until they simply stopped fighting. She had spoken with the arrogance of someone who had played this game before, who knew all the rules and how to twist them in her favor. But Lucas wasn't going to play by their rules. He wasn't going to get tangled up in their bureaucratic bullshit, wasn't going to spend months in court while they continued to chip away at his land. He needed to break their grip before they could tighten it further, and that meant figuring out exactly how deep this went. He wasn't just up against one woman with too much free time and a clipboard. This was bigger. There were too many moving parts, too many things that had already been set in motion before he had even set foot back in town. He drove into town the next morning, the lack of sleep making his nerves raw and his patience non-existent. The municipal building was as lifeless as before, the same slow-moving clerk sitting behind the counter with the same tired expression, but Lucas didn't have time for politeness. He asked for everything: full property records, transfer documents, community meeting minutes, anything with his name or his grandfather's name attached to it. The clerk sighed, rolling his eyes like it was a personal inconvenience, but eventually, after several minutes of tapping at the keyboard, he started printing. Lucas stood there, hands braced against the counter, forcing himself to remain calm even as the machine spit out sheet after sheet of evidence that something had been very wrong for a long time. When he grabbed the stack, he didn't even have to dig deep before he saw it. A petition. Over 30 names, all signed in agreement that his land should be absorbed into the district due to lack of active ownership and significant neglect. He scanned the list, his eyes catching familiar names, people he had known for years, people who had sat in his grandfather's kitchen and shared meals, people who had watched him grow up and still had signed away his home without hesitation. His stomach twisted, but not with surprise. He had known something like this had happened. He had known they had waited for him to be gone, to be out of the way, to make their move when he wasn't there to stop it. But seeing it in writing, seeing the names of actual people who had put their signatures down and decided that his home no longer belonged to him, made something settle deep in his chest. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. The first thing he needed to do was talk to someone who had signed, someone who might crack under pressure, and he already had the perfect person in mind. Eleanor Riggs had lived 2 doors down from his property for as long as he could remember. She had always been kind to his grandfather, always stopped to chat when she saw him outside. If there was anyone who could be convinced to talk, it was her. He pulled into her driveway, turned off the engine, and walked up to the front porch. When she opened the door, her expression flickered between guilt and fear. She knew why he was here. He didn't waste time. He pulled out the petition and pointed to her name. "You signed this." Eleanor's lips parted slightly. her hands fidgeting in front of her as she stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind her like she didn't want anyone else to hear. "Lucas, Marian told us it was just a formality," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "She said it was to keep the neighborhood safe, to make sure the land didn't fall into the wrong hands." "She said she lied," he interrupted. "You know that now, don't you?" She swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "I didn't know they were going to take the house. I thought it was just paperwork, something about taxes or zoning. I swear, Lucas, I would never." He held up a hand, cutting her off. He didn't care about apologies. He cared about leverage. Who else regrets signing? Eleanor hesitated, glancing around like she was afraid someone might be watching. The Petersons, she admitted, and Gerald Young. They were upset when they found out what was really happening. "But Lucas, you have to understand people don't want to make trouble. Marian has connections. I don't give a damn what connections she has," he said, voice cold. "If people are afraid of her, that means she has something to lose. And that means I have a way to hurt her." Eleanor's face paled, but she didn't argue. Instead, she gave him a warning. "Marian doesn't like being challenged," she said softly, "and she always gets what she wants." Lucas didn't respond. He just turned and walked back to his truck, his mind already working through his next move. He had what he needed. Now it was time to use it. By the time he got back to his property, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the trees. He pulled into the driveway, his entire body thrumming with anticipation. But something felt off. The air was too still, too quiet. Then he saw it. The chains on the gate were gone. His stomach tightened. He killed the engine and stepped out slowly, scanning the area. His boots crunched against the gravel as he moved toward the house, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. And then he saw the front door was wide open. Lucas didn't hesitate. He pulled the tire iron from his truck and stepped inside, his pulse hammering in his ears. The house was trashed. Drawers yanked open, furniture overturned, his belongings scattered across the floor. Someone had gone through everything. And in the middle of the mess, nailed to the wall with a single rusted nail, was a piece of paper. Lucas ripped it down, scanning the words, his breathing turning sharp. Notice of violation. Unauthorized occupation of community property. Immediate removal required. At the bottom, Marian's signature was printed in perfect, curling script. Lucas's fingers tightened around the paper, crushing it in his grip. They weren't just pushing back. They were escalating. They thought this would scare him. They had no idea what they had just started. Lucas stood in the wreckage of his own home, his pulse slow and heavy, the kind of quiet rage that didn't explode but burned deep, consuming everything in its path. The message was clear. They weren't just trying to intimidate him anymore. They weren't playing games, drowning him in paperwork and bureaucracy, hoping he'd get frustrated and walk away. This was a warning, a demonstration of power, a statement that they were in control, that he was nothing but an inconvenience to be removed. They had gone through his things, invaded his space, destroyed what they didn't like, and left their little notice behind as if it were some official decree, as if their authority was absolute, as if they truly believed they had the right to erase him from his own land. They had no idea what they had just done. Lucas didn't bother cleaning up. He left the mess exactly as it was, stepping over broken furniture and upturned drawers as he made his way to the back door, shoving it open with more force than necessary. He stalked toward his truck, yanking open the door and pulling out his phone. He had considered going to the police, had even entertained the idea of taking the legal route, but the moment he saw that paper with Marian's signature, all those options dissolved. There was no law here, there was no justice. The system had already been turned against him, twisted into a tool for people like Marian to take what they wanted and silence anyone who stood in their way. If they wanted to play dirty, so would he. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering for a second before he hit the call button. The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Didn't expect to hear from you again." The man said, his voice slow, deliberate, with the kind of weight that suggested he didn't say anything unless it mattered. Lucas exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. "I need a favor." There was a pause, a quiet inhale. The kind of favor that costs money, the kind that costs time, Lucas corrected. But yeah, probably money too. Another pause, then a low chuckle. All right, tell me what you need. Lucas kept his voice level, but his fingers tightened around the phone as he spoke. I need to know exactly how deep this goes. Who's pulling the strings? Who's benefiting? Who's making money off of this? He glanced back at his house, at the ruined interior visible through the open door. And I need leverage. Leverage, the man repeated, his tone neutral. Something they don't want getting out, Lucas clarified. Something that makes them back off before this turns into something worse. The man on the other end made a thoughtful noise. And if they don't back off, Lucas's jaw clenched. Then I bury them. A short silence, then another chuckle. You haven't changed. Lucas didn't respond. He didn't need to. I'll look into it, the man finally said. Give me a day. Lucas ended the call and climbed into his truck, gripping the steering wheel as the anger simmered just beneath the surface. He didn't have a day to sit around waiting, but he also knew rushing in without a plan would be playing right into their hands. They had resources, influence, people willing to bend the rules for them. If he wanted to win, he had to be smart. He had to be patient. But patience had never been his strong suit, and waiting while they continued their campaign to erase him was not an option. He spent the next several hours reinforcing the house. He boarded up the windows, replaced the locks with industrial-grade deadbolts, installed motion sensors around the perimeter, and rigged up cameras in hidden locations. They had broken in once, and they would try again. But next time they wouldn't just be leaving a notice. Next time they'd be caught. By the time night fell, Lucas was wired, his body thrumming with restless energy. He sat on the porch, a cold beer in one hand, his other resting on the tire iron he had yet to put back in the truck. The woods surrounding his property were dark, the river in the distance a constant, steady murmur beneath the chirp of insects and rustling leaves. For a while there was nothing. Just the quiet, just the waiting. Then, at exactly 2:30 in the morning, the motion sensor at the edge of his property triggered. Lucas's grip on the tire iron tightened as he stood, his body shifting into something predatory, something sharp. He moved carefully, staying in the shadows, his breath slow and controlled as he peered around the side of the house. The light from the motion sensor cast long shadows against the trees, illuminating two figures moving toward his gate. They weren't trying to be subtle. Lucas exhaled slowly, his muscles coiling, his mind already calculating every possible outcome. He could confront them now, make it clear that he wasn't going anywhere. But that would be too easy. Too predictable. He wanted them to feel watched. Wanted them to know that they weren't the only ones who could play this game. So he stayed where he was, silent and still, watching as they reached the gate and stopped. One of them, a taller man with broad shoulders, pulled something from his jacket, a bolt cutter. The other, shorter but stockier, glanced around, checking for any signs of movement. Lucas smiled to himself. They thought they were being careful. The man with the bolt cutter leaned forward, positioning the tool around the chain securing the gate. Lucas reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen. The floodlights exploded to life. The two men flinched, their heads snapping up, eyes wide with shock as they were suddenly bathed in harsh, white light. For a second, they didn't move, frozen in place like animals caught in a hunter's scope. Then Lucas stepped forward. Neither of them spoke as he approached, his footsteps slow, deliberate, his expression unreadable. The taller man recovered first, straightening slightly, his grip tightening around the bolt cutter. "This is community property," he said, his voice firm, but there was an edge to it, something uncertain. Lucas didn't respond. He just tilted his head slightly, letting the silence stretch, letting them feel it. The shorter man shifted uncomfortably. "Look, we're just following orders," he said. "We don't want trouble." Lucas smiled then, slow and sharp. "That's too bad," he murmured. "Because you found it." The taller man moved first, dropping the bolt cutter and stepping back, his hands raising slightly in a placating gesture. "Hey, no need for that," he said quickly. "We'll just—" Lucas took another step closer. They flinched. That was all he needed. He let the silence stretch a little longer, then finally spoke, his voice low and even. "Tell Marion Hudson," he said, his gaze locked onto them, "that if she wants a war, she's got one." Neither of them argued. They turned and left, their retreat swift, their shoulders tight with tension. Lucas watched them go, his heart a steady, controlled rhythm in his chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Lucas didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch with a loaded shotgun resting across his lap, his gaze fixed on the driveway where the two men had stood hours earlier, bolt cutters in hand, ready to cut their way through his property line like it was nothing. They had left, but that meant nothing. It wasn't retreat. It was regrouping. They would be back with new tactics, with new strategies, maybe with legal threats, maybe with something worse. He had made his move, sent his message, and now it was their turn. He wasn't stupid enough to believe that he had scared them off. No, he had forced them to escalate. By the time the first rays of sunlight broke over the tree line, Lucas had already showered, changed, and was driving into town. He had no intention of waiting for Marion Hudson to make her next move. If they wanted a war, he was bringing the fight to them. He parked his truck outside the town hall, walking through the glass doors with the kind of determined stride that made people move out of his way without even realizing why. He didn't stop at the front desk, didn't wait to be announced. He knew exactly where Marion's office was. He had seen it before, the carefully arranged furniture, the framed certificates, the window that overlooked the manicured streets of the district she ruled over like some suburban dictator. He pushed the door open without knocking, stepping inside, his presence filling the room before she even had the chance to look up from her desk. She wasn't alone. Two men sat across from her, their suits crisp, their postures too controlled, too professional. Lucas knew exactly what they were before Marion even spoke. Lawyers. She had been expecting this. Expecting him. She sighed, setting down her pen, folding her hands neatly on the desk like a patient teacher dealing with an unruly student. Lucas, she said smoothly, you really should make appointments. Lucas ignored her, his gaze flicking between the two men before settling back on her. You sent your people to my house last night, he said, his voice even, controlled, but carrying an unmistakable edge. Tried to cut my gate. Broke into my house. Left a lovely little note telling me to get out. He took a step closer, leaning slightly over her desk. You don't get to play innocent. Marion didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply sighed again, shaking her head as if he were the unreasonable one. Lucas, you're occupying property that has been legally reassigned. I've explained this to you. If you continue to resist, you will be removed. One of the lawyers finally spoke, his voice dry and clipped. Mr. Morris, we have filed an official request for enforcement. If you do not vacate the premises within 72 hours, further action will be taken. Lucas tilted his head slightly. Further action. The second lawyer adjusted his tie. Police intervention. Potential civil litigation. At this point, you're trespassing. Lucas let out a slow breath, the kind that wasn't meant to calm but to keep control. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a folder, and tossed it onto Marion's desk. She hesitated for the first time before opening it, flipping through the documents inside. Then, for the first time since this had started, her expression changed. Just slightly. Just enough for Lucas to see the crack. These are county records, he said, his voice almost casual. Records that show a significant amount of financial discrepancies linked to your little community expansion project. Unapproved zoning changes. Property tax funds that don't match the records. And my personal favorite, illegal use of eminent domain on land that isn't actually eligible for it. He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. You've been stealing land, Marion. Not just mine. Marion's lips pressed together into a thin line, her fingers tightening slightly on the edges of the folder. The lawyers exchanged quick glances, their previously unshakable confidence suddenly faltering. Lucas could feel it. The way the energy in the room shifted, the way the carefully constructed walls around her started to splinter. She recovered quickly, snapping the folder shut, her expression smoothing back into neutrality. This doesn't change anything, she said. Whatever information you think you have, it won't hold up in court. You're grasping at straws. Lucas smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind that made people nervous. Oh, I don't need to take it to court, he said, his voice almost light. "I just need to take it to the right people." The county auditor's office, the local newspaper, hell, maybe even some folks at the state level who would love to take down a corrupt little district official who's been pocketing land like a real estate mogul. He leaned forward again, his voice lowering just slightly. "How do you think that'll play out for you?" Marion didn't respond. She didn't have to. He had her. He knew he had her. The lawyers were already shifting in their seats, already mentally calculating damage control. There were fights they were prepared for, and then there were fights that weren't worth having. Lucas picked up the folder, tucking it back under his arm. "So here's how this is going to go," he said, his voice still calm, still controlled, but carrying the weight of someone who wasn't asking. "You're going to rescind the reassignment on my property. You're going to withdraw your complaint. And you're going to make damn sure that no one in your little circle ever so much as sets foot near my land again." He tilted his head slightly. "Or I start making calls." Marion held his gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, she exhaled through her nose and nodded once. A single, tight movement full of resentment. Full of resentment. Full of defeat. Lucas didn't smile. He just turned and walked out of the office, leaving the door open behind him. By the time he got back to his property, the weight in his chest had finally eased. He parked the truck, stepping out, taking in the land around him. It was still his. It had always been his. And now finally it would stay that way. He locked the gate behind him, walked up the porch steps, and sat down in the old wooden chair his grandfather had built. It was over, and he had won. Lucas sat on the porch of his house, staring out at the land that had nearly been stolen from him. The weight of the past few weeks was still heavy in his chest, but for the first time since returning, he could breathe. The fight was over. Marion Hudson had folded under pressure, the lawyers had disappeared back into whatever corporate offices they had crawled out of, and the paperwork that had declared his land no longer his had been erased from the system just as easily as it had been placed there. It should have been satisfying, but all he felt was exhaustion. The damage was done. Not just to the house, to the land, to the property that had been trashed in an effort to break him, but to his view of this town, these people, the ones who had known his grandfather, who had smiled at him as a kid, who had signed their names on the petition that had nearly taken everything from him. He had won, but the victory was hollow in a way he hadn't expected. He had wanted justice, but what he got was compliance, begrudging acceptance, people backing down not because they had seen the error of their ways, but because they had been forced to. He exhaled, running a hand down his face, the exhaustion settling deeper into his bones. The past few weeks had been a lesson in how easily people could be manipulated, how quickly they could justify taking what wasn't theirs if someone in a position of power told them it was the right thing to do. He had spent so much time thinking about Marion as the enemy that he hadn't really stopped to consider the people who had stood behind her, the ones who had helped, who had signed the petition, who had watched his home get taken piece by piece, and said nothing. And now that he had won, they would all pretend it had never happened. That was what burned the most. He pushed himself up from the chair, walking down the steps of the porch, his boots crunching against the dirt path as he made his way toward the fence line. The new locks on the gate gleamed in the early morning light, thick, heavy, unbreakable. He had spent the past day reinforcing everything, adding new security measures, making sure that if anyone even thought about trying something again, they would regret it. The cameras were hidden, the alarms were set, and the next person who stepped onto his land without permission wouldn't just be dealing with legal repercussions. He wasn't going to let himself be caught off guard again. He reached the edge of the property and stopped, looking out at the road beyond. It was quiet now, no cars, no unwanted visitors, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But it didn't feel safe. Not yet, maybe not ever. The land was his, legally, officially, but he knew that didn't mean it was over. People like Marion didn't just disappear. They retreated, they waited, they watched. And even if she never came back, there would always be others. There would always be someone looking at his land and seeing an opportunity. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from an unknown number. He opened it, scanning the short, clipped text. "It's done. Paperwork is clean. No loose ends. You're clear. Lucas exhaled, slipping the phone back into his pocket. It was confirmation of what he already knew. Everything had been wiped. Everything had been set back to the way it should have been, but it didn't make him feel any better. He had won, but he still felt like he had lost something in the process. He turned back toward the house, making his way up the path, his mind already working through the next steps. He had spent the past few weeks on defense, reacting to every move Marion and her people had made, always one step behind, always playing their game. That was over. He wasn't just going to sit back and hope they left him alone. He was going to make sure they never had the chance to try this again. The first thing he did was hire a surveyor to reassess the land boundaries, to make sure there were no loopholes left, no gaps that could be exploited, no technicalities that could be used against him. Then he went to the county records office himself, sitting down with every official who had been involved in the reassignment process, making sure that the paper trail leading back to Marion was solid, that if she ever tried anything like this again, it wouldn't just be a fight over land, it would be a criminal case. He wasn't going to leave any doors open. But it wasn't just about the legal side of things. It was about the town, about the people who had let this happen, who had stood by and watched as his home was stolen from him. He started going into town more, making his presence known, making sure they saw him, that they knew he wasn't some faceless name on a petition, that he was real, that he wasn't going anywhere. He didn't speak to them about what had happened. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. The tension in the air when he walked into the diner, the way conversations stopped when he passed by, the way some people couldn't even meet his eyes, that was enough. He rebuilt not just the house, not just the land, but the sense of security that had been ripped away from him. It took time, weeks of careful planning, of reinforcing every weak spot, of making sure that if anyone ever tried to take what was his again, they wouldn't just be dealing with paperwork and legal battles. They would be dealing with him. He had spent too long assuming that the world played fair, that if he followed the rules, everything would work out in the end. He wasn't making that mistake again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, casting the land in long shadows, he stood on the porch, looking out at everything his grandfather had built, everything that had almost been taken. He had won. The land was his. But he knew that didn't mean it was over. There would always be another Marion Hudson, another group of people who thought they could take what wasn't theirs, another fight waiting just around the corner. But he was ready. And this time he wouldn't just fight back. He'd make sure they never even thought about coming for him again.